Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. As long as there have been humans, there have been wars. And as long as there have been wars, there have been debates about wars, especially in democratic societies like ours. My guest today is Professor David Nickell, who teaches sociology and philosophy, but not at the same time, here on campus. He's teaching a course called The Ethics of War and Peace. Welcome to the program. Ethics and war. How does that square?
This actually goes back and is a really ancient debate. As a matter of fact, in the class we begin with the readings from the ancient Romans, all the way up to, well, Plato and Aristotle, in the beginnings of what's now called just war theory. And we get some of these, like the letter from Cicero to Nero, trying to argue that he should have compassion for people of lesser power than himself, rather than just slaughtering them all.
Compassion was not one of Nero's long suits.
No. So this is a strong argument for basic human dignity, basic human rights first being laid out there. You get the arguments that start out saying there are certain duties that we owe even to those who have wronged us. And this is one of the earliest statements of some form of social contract theory that says every individual, even our enemies, have rights, and we have a duty to uphold those, to take that into account, and that it's to our own advantage to do it. This gets brought forward into modern social contract theory with Hobbes, John Locke, and from Locke gets built into our own Constitution. And we have a government that's founded on this, and this is also the foundation of international law, like the Geneva Convention.
Mm-hmm. I guess what the tension you have here is, if you go to war, you want to win the war, but at what price? So we have what are called the rules of engagement, the rules of war.
Yes. And in the class, we look at this. Now, one of the things, this is a philosophy class. So we take all sides on things. We look at all opposing arguments. Most of the students that come into this class are confused. They see the things on the news. They're upset. They don't know what to believe, what's going on. And one of the things I try to get through to them is that these are complex and very nuanced sort of questions, not just for the political part of it, but for the ethical parts as well. From way back, from some of the Old Testament documents, you have that when you go in to attack a village, you are to slaughter everything there, including the infant children, and leave none of the animals alive, just a scorched earth policy. Mm-hmm. To some of the later Roman writings where if the enemy is willing to lay down their arms, you make them citizens, mm-hmm. give them full rights. And by treating them this way and showing the mercy to them, they have loyalty to your government, so it's in your best interest in the long run to do that. So we start contrasting these, and then
Well, I guess one of the issues you think about is, let's say that you do play by the rules of war, you do abide by the Geneva Convention, but the enemy doesn't.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Those are really difficult questions. How does a side with more morals, higher standards, higher principles deal with an enemy that has seemingly no morals and no principles? And we look at a lot of different arguments on that, some of which say, written by some generals and everything, that when you're dealing with an enemy this way, the best possible approach is to go in and slaughter them as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible and get it over with. The Powell Doctrine was sort of based on this approach, which was that you go in with overwhelming force to the extent that the enemy will either be defeated very quickly with as few losses on your side as possible, or else they will see that any resistance is futile and they'll give up. And at that point you can reason with them once you've got them completely surrounded and threatened. But the other approaches to this are that it only appears from our side that they have no morals, no principles. What they actually have is a different perspective and a different set of principles maybe. So one of the examples I usually give to my students is from the British standpoint, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were traitors.
Had the Americans lost, they for sure would have been
That's
traitors.
right. They would have gone down in history as traitors. The Boston Tea Party was, they didn't use the word at the time, but it was a terrorist action. I have a friend that lives in Canada now whose family was moved there after the Revolutionary War because they had been Tories. They were loyalists to the king and weren't comfortable staying in the new United States.
Can you imagine that?
So the Canadian government offered them land if those loyalists would come north and settle in Canada. They were trying to get the area populated. He's very proud of the fact that he's a descendant of Benedict Arnold, because from their perspective, Benedict Arnold was a hero who gave his life for the cause. It's a completely different perspective, and I remember talking to him about this, and it just being a real stunner.
Well, you know,
I'd never heard of it.
A Benedict Arnold is a traitor. It's a term
Right.
for a traitor used for anything. Is a
Right.
Benedict Arnold.
And from the standpoint of the British, he was their guy who gave his life trying to oppose the traitors.
Well,
So to bring that up in modern terms, there's a tendency to try to see anything like a war in terms of just black and white, yes, no, good and evil. Except in Walt Disney movies and cartoons, nobody thinks they're evil. People don't do things because they're trying to be evil. The September 11th hijackers did not believe they were evil. They really believed they were fighting on the side of God and trying to fight the evil forces. And when you understand that, then you can get around those kinds of issues. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to listen to you at that point, but it gives you a different perspective on it to see how we should strategize in trying to deal with this enemy so that we're not creating more enemies.
Do you think part of the ambiguity, if you go back and you look at wars, of our parents' generation, World War II was clear cut. It was the good guys versus the bad guys. I mean, that was obvious. Along comes Korea.
Well, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there are some examples in history of people who were tyrants, oppressed their people, did terrible things, and had absolutely no illusion whatsoever that they were doing it for the cause of good. But there are very few of those. Maybe Joseph Stalin, probably Saddam Hussein. But Adolf Hitler really believed he was doing this for the betterment of humanity. Now, whether he could justify that, but at least he had justified it in his own mind. If you read any of his writings, he thought he was purifying the human race and restoring us back, bringing about the Third Reich, the Third order. And that's an important distinction when you're trying to figure out what will this person do. What will they do next? And if they think they're out for power, glory, or whatever it is, they're going to behave differently if they think they're out for power, glory, or whatever it is, they're going to behave differently. And that's an important distinction when you're trying to figure out what will this person do? What will they do next? And if they think they're doing this for the cause of good, they're going to behave differently if they think God is on their side than if they just think they're out for power, glory, or whatever it is. They're going to make different calculations. They're going to react in different ways, and it's important to know those distinctions.
But since the war, you've got Korea, and that's somewhat ambiguous. Vietnam is big time ambiguous. And we've got the war in Iraq, which has also divided the American people. In other words, what I'm getting at is the American people were unified in World War II. There was a clear-cut enemy. It was the Japanese imperialists and the German Nazis. Korea, again, it was to roll back communism. Vietnam, it became very murky. And again, regardless of whether one supports the Iraq war or not, there's a lot of opposition to that.
Yes.
Is that part of the confusion maybe kids have?
Yes, and I think too it's important to hold apart the war that's going on in Afghanistan and the war that's going on in Iraq. And I think when we went into Afghanistan after the Taliban, and there's all kinds of complexities there, and this is what, in this course I try to do this to really draw out all those complexities. Like that Iran and other Muslim countries came forward and offered to help us catch bin Laden shortly after the September 11th attacks. And because they believed what bin Laden did was an affront to Islam. They recognized that Islam does not justify that kind of thing.
Well,
it was after we had speeches about embarking on a new crusade and then started going into Iraq.
And that's a loaded word in that part of the world, crusade.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that's the kind of thing I try to draw out in this class to get them to see different perspectives, and that just because we perceive something to be one way and understand that, and to us, from our cultural perspective, a crusade is a good thing. It's a positive thing.
A crusader is a good person.
Right. From the perspective of the Middle East, the Crusades were a devastating stage in their history. It threw them into their own dark ages. They were the pinnacle of civilization in that part of the world at the time. The Roman Empire collapsed. Western Europe was in the Dark Ages. The Moors and those people in what is now Spain, in that part of the world, had highly developed civilizations, elaborate cities laid out with running water in the fountains.
And had preserved much of the ancient Greek and Roman culture.
That's right. They had the original writings of Aristotle, Euclid, all these things there. They had public libraries. The majority of the population was literate. And Western Europe at that time in the Dark Ages, the majority of the population was illiterate. They had lost all that knowledge with the collapse of when a culture collapses, the knowledge base it has collapses with it. Mm-hmm. So the world's littered with the remains of fallen civilizations, and the descendants of the people that built all those, whether it's pyramids or whatever it is, these huge architectural things, are living in the shadows, literally in the shadows of those buildings, and can't read the writing on the walls. They don't know who built it, why they did it, how they did it. That knowledge is lost. And Western Europe was in that kind of state in its dark ages. The Crusades threw the Muslim world into that kind of situation. They ultimately won the Crusades, threw the invaders back out. It's important to note too, and this surprises a lot of my students, the Crusades were against the infidels. The infidels was not only the Muslims, it was also the Jews.
Oh, yes.
And the Jews and the Muslims were living side by side in Jerusalem and these places at the time, getting along just fine back then. These things have strange twists as you go through history.
And I think you're making a point, is now religion by nature, religions are ethical institutions, theoretically. But look at all the bloodshed that's been done in the name of my God or your God or somebody else's God. Do you talk about that in class?
You can't hardly avoid it. You mentioned World War II. That was a war in which everybody involved believed they're fighting directly for God. Hitler was bringing about the Third Reich. The German belt buckle said "Gott mit uns."
That's right, with a swastika in the middle.
That's right. And the swastika was a perverted, that was an ancient cross, form of the cross. It never had the same meaning again that it used to.
Right.
But Hitler usurped that symbol and used it. The Japanese, of course, were coming from this very ancient ascendancy back to the sun gods, and they were trying to restore their position in the world and fighting directly for God. And of course, we were fighting Hitler and the Japanese, so we had to be on the side of God.
And there are wars in which Christians fight Christians.
Right.
Protestant against Catholic, Catholic against Catholic, Protestant against Protestant.
Yes, look at Ireland.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, a good British friend of ours who's in his 70s now, he's retired from the British Army, used to be a beefeater, a guide at the Tower of London. And he said that in studying British history, he concluded, and I can quote him faithfully, The trouble with British history is we've had too many Catholics, too many Protestants, and not enough Christians. And I often quote him, retired warrant officer of artillery in the British Army.
Yeah.
And I find that ironic. You know, two armies pray before they attack each other, and they could be Christian armies. Well, you go back to when France and Britain are fighting back in the Middle Ages.
Right. Well, religion.
100 Years' War.
Religion actually performs two very important functions that are often at odds with each other. One is it holds traditional values, patterns in place, and this is where you get the God and country alliance going together, and that's usually a dangerous thing. Mm-hmm. It's praised by the people who believe it, right, in that country, but for anybody else, that's a dangerous thing. But that is an important function for a culture because it keeps the essential patterns of behavior, values, core values, and things from changing too quickly. It causes people to be loyal to their place. The other function religion performs is to move us forward, advance from where we are, to pursue social justice, to pursue peace. So at the same time you've got the people justifying the war based on religion, you've got the people opposing the war based on the same religion. Mm-hmm. And it performs both of those functions.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned a few moments ago, I think, the Old Testament, Moses, the Ten Commandments. And I often say this in class, trying to be, somewhat humorous anyway, is I say you go around western Kentucky and you see all these Ten Commandments in people's yards, thou shalt not kill. But there's an asterisk by that, unless you need killing. So how do the Ten Commandments is based on what's in the Scripture. It's pretty straightforward. Thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say in the exception of it. So how do students talk about that issue?
Yes, and language it's not just pieces of sound that we make. The reason we're able to use it to communicate with each other, at least we hope we do, is it has meaning. It's symbolic. The word we use, the term we use to refer to something, shapes our evaluation of it. All language is evaluative. So you get into all kinds of problems when you go translating languages from one language to another. Because there are a lot of concepts you just cannot literally translate from one language to another.
Right.
It just doesn't work. Also, these meanings, the terms, the words we use, what they mean changes over time.
Right.
It drifts, just like our accents and things drift. So, for instance, in 1700s, early 1700s, the British and the American colonists probably sounded the same. Now we can hardly understand each other. You're getting the right parts of the countries, and both sides have drifted apart. And it's not just the accents, but the meanings of the words, how we use them.
And even some spellings.
Right. Mm-hmm. And all languages do this, except Latin, which is a dead language and is now fossilized.
Right.
But the Hebrew words, the Greek words, the Aramaic words that are translated into English, it's real problematic what they really meant originally. A lot of people say when it says thou shalt not kill, what it really means is thou shalt not murder. And then they argue that, what's the difference between murdering and killing? Murdering is killing one of us. If you kill one of them in the right circumstances, we'll give you a medal and a parade. Somehow or another, there's this thing built in, and this again gets into those two elements of religion, because some people want to say, it's all about protecting us and defending us against them. And others are saying, no, it's about expanding beyond all those boundaries and including all of us. And that gives you a completely different, and those are two compelling forces in religion that are going on. And I think right now you're seeing the same kind of things going on in the Middle East, for instance. We were talking about earlier Western Europe having been in the Dark Ages and coming out of it with the Renaissance, which was literally a result of the Crusades. With the Crusades, we went into these Muslim countries tore down their cities, drove them out. Part of what they did with this, the way they paid soldiers back then was called the right of pillage, where the soldiers, when you came in and defeated a town, then had the right to go in and ransack and pillage, take whatever they could of any value, and that was their pay. One exception to that was the contents of the libraries were brought back to Western Europe. And where most people were illiterate, the only people who could still read and write were the monks inside the monasteries. And reading and writing in Western Europe at the time during the Dark Ages was a high art. It was like magic. Two people could look at scribbles on a piece of paper and know what the other one was thinking. If you didn't know how to read and write, didn't know what it was, that was magic.
It's mystical. Yeah.
Yes, and which was part of the status of, kept those monks in power and kept people from overthrowing them because they were these magical beings. They brought back all those books from the Crusades, and the very first university in Europe was established specifically to translate the writings they brought back from there. And that contained the writings of Aristotle, Euclid, mathematics, geometry, all this basic science that resulted in the Renaissance, which means literally the rebirth.
Right.
It was a rebirth of the knowledge, and that eventually led to the Enlightenment. At the same time, the Middle East is thrown back into its civilization crumbles as a result of all that, even though they won, drove out the Crusaders finally after a long period of time. The Renaissance is often portrayed in movies as this really happy time. It wasn't like that. This was the time of the Inquisitions. This was a brutal, oppressive time with the battles between the progressives that wanted to take this new knowledge that they were bringing and apply it to the world, do science, increase our understandings. This resulted ultimately in the trial of Galileo, which is the beginning of the Enlightenment, which says if you have a conflict between church doctrine and logic, science, empirical data, science is right, the church is wrong. That's a dramatic blow to the church, and they resisted that mightily.
Sure.
And this was it was a bloody time. The Orthodoxy fought that tooth and nail. This is what's going on in the Middle East right now. You've got the Orthodoxy, the old hardline fundamentalists that don't want anything to change, believe we should still be living the same way we did when Muhammad was alive. Nothing should change. Status of women should not change. Everything should be just, nothing should be allowed to change at all. Versus the progressive element that's coming along and saying, no, we should be increasing our understandings. We've got a rational capacity. We should be using that. That doesn't mean they have to quit being Islamic. They can use knowledge in ways that conform to Islam, but they need to be advancing and bringing in science, which means they have to get rid of this inshallah way of thinking, which means everything that happens is the will of God right here. Nothing can happen.
But there are some Christians who believe that.
Yes, struggle is going on here, but they're not in power, at least not to enough extent to bring us back down and start. We have calls on TV right now, on the news, that what we need to do is finally defeat the Muslim extremists. And I'm sitting here listening to this thinking, what about religious extremism of all kinds? Because we have people here, they have people in all religions, Hindus, most religions that would like to take everything back to the way it was, get rid of progress, get rid of modernity.
And you're talking about the use of words.
Yes.
Most extremists don't think they are extremists.
Right.
They think you are.
Yes, absolutely. It's all a matter of perspective on this.
Yeah.
But the people who are, for the most part, the ones who have believed in science, thought it was a legitimate way to know the world, and that we should move forward, that believed in progress, have been in control. In the Middle East, they have not. Not since we threw them back with the Crusades. or they threw themselves back, you might say. They won, but their civilization collapsed as a result of it, what it cost them to win that victory. And now their hardliners are the ones who don't believe in progress, believe this world is tainted and you shouldn't be, it's a waste of time to try to know anything about it. They're in a situation very much like in the Dark Ages. We went for 1,000 years that most historians say that the major technological innovations in Western Europe during the 1,000 years of the Dark Ages was the invention of the horse stirrup and the horse collar. These were major innovations, but for 1,000 years, that's
the best you can do.
Yeah, but you got to figure if in that way of thinking, if a plague comes through, not everybody gets sick. What determines who gets sick and who doesn't? For the post-Enlightenment scientific way of looking at this, it's who has natural immunity, who's exposed to the bacteria, the virus, whatever it is. And even those that get sick, some die, some don't. Well, again, it's natural immunities, right? You start looking for causes. The traditional way of doing this, the old way, was it's God's will. It's God's punishment if you get sick and you weren't living right. So from that viewpoint, it's heretical to try to find the cause of the disease, much less try to cure it. That is blasphemous because you're usurping the will of God to try to do that. It's the Enlightenment that brings in this view that it's not contradictory to religion. And I think even most of what we call the conservative religious people in our society still accept, for the most part, that healthcare is not a bad thing. It's not contradictory to religion to try to understand the cause of things, try to find cures for disease, try to improve the quality of human life. At one time, that was considered blasphemous to do that. And that struggle between those two views is going on right now in the Middle East. And you look at how bloody, how violent that was in Western Europe when we made that transition there. And you think, if you were an outsider, would you want to go be in the middle of that? And that's the situation we're in, is being stuck in that intercultural struggle that's going on there now. And the main reason we're there is because, I hate to use the old word here, but because our way of life is dependent on oil right now. And that's where a goodly portion of the oil is. We've got other sources of it, but you can't eliminate that amount too. So.
A goodly portion of our time has run out. In fact, all of our time has run out. Thanks for joining us. My guest today was David Nickell. I'm Barry Craig. We'll see you next time.